Yo, hi, hello, welcome, or welcome back. There's all this rambling around the internet about polyamory and polyamorous relationships, um, and divine or sacred, and I just can't help myself at the grand miscommunications of all of this, and so here I am to chime in. I've been polyamorous for over a decade. Um, so I've seen the great, beautiful parts of it, and I've seen when it does not work out. And that has a lot to do with our motivations and our understandings. And so we're going to break down these understandings so that we have a better idea of the geometry of our relationships. This is a theory that I've been working on for a little while. So they are, in fact, a really beautiful thing. I think some of my most honest and communicative relationships have been polyamorous. And conversely, I think a lot of people are exploiting the concept to collect tools of validation, or to avoid entirely their own commitment issues. And I think that is the polyamory that's evolving. And I hope to visually clarify this so that we can all be more reciprocal and reciprocating in relationships, and dispel this use of them. But before we get into the geometry of it, a symbol that we all may be familiar with, but especially the way that I hear it defined, do we have a clear understanding of it? And I think that's very interesting how misunderstood lovers and loving is. But in the tarot deck, in the Lovers card, oftentimes you will see that there are three figures. Oftentimes people will say that it's a new relationship, that somebody's entering your life, but that's just the surface of it. That's just the surface of it. In the deck that I use, there are three characters and also an angel. But it's a little bit more of an occult deck, maybe. So, love is a growing thing. But so we have this three, or ultimately would be grounding, would be a happy home. But we'll focus on the three because that's typically the case, and because we're going to work with the geometry of these relationships. Can I just copy that? That's what I'm gonna do. Bam! Yeah! We're gonna focus on one triangle for a moment. And we'll call this one monogamy. In very monogamous, oftentimes motivated by religious values, relationships, you have your partner and you have your other partner. And often what I hear is that it is not a marriage unless it is under God. Alpha, Omega, right? Unless it is under God. That's why it's in a church. That's why there's priests. That's why everybody's got to be there. Witnesses. But God being the ultimate witness. I've heard people also say that because of that, God is present in your marriage, which would make it kind of kinky. But don't tell them that, maybe. Or maybe do, so that they freak the fuck out. But in these relationships, oftentimes that is not the case. Oftentimes it is one party elevating themselves and subordinating the other. We have the servant master dynamic that people preach about, trad wives values. And those are often very imbalanced, very unstable, very constraining relationships. And by these angles, because in this triangle formation in this tetrahedron structure. Granted, this is two-dimensional, but bear with me. These angles would not be able to inform each other. These angles would only separate each other or create further division or resistance, I suppose. They would not have a capacity for love. If, because it doesn't always work, one way, unfortunately, we see a lot of very gendered language around relationships. Because that's the only language a lot of people really have to understand these things. But it can change. Anybody can be toxic. Don't let anybody surprise you. But it can change, in which case one party is elevating themselves and the other party is subordinated. Different side of the coin, same bullshit. Both are imbalanced, do not make for a right triangle. Another geometrical relationship would be like Latter-day Saints and what have you, the religious cults that take on multiple wives, multiple. Another example in this geometry of relationship that we will see is, again, an elevation of the self, to equate with God, or to equate the self with God, to equate the self with an alternate plane. This is also the geometry of I think, like religious cults that take on many wives, is to elevate their legacy, to elevate their relationship to God, and ultimately subordinating time and attention to multiple people. I do know it's also, I mean, I can only speculate, but I have a theory that it's also a tax thing, because they're already tax evading through religious reasons, and then to be able to have multiple children through multiple wives is further tax evasion, each through different children. Which is funny because those parties typically were pointing fingers about other people. So ironic. Conversely, and also, is it? In a polyamorous relationship, I love how that just looks. There you go. There you go. We have your partner, pink, pink, and we have another partner, and ideally, we expand the circle to bring in another partner. I didn't draw that right, but that's okay. There's actually many symbols for this. It's interesting. There's, even in that context, there's more than two. Um, but so in poly situations, you have your main relationship, right? And one person wants to branch out, the other person wants to branch out, party on. What ends up happening a lot is one person is like, you can't stop me from exploring my life. And the other person's like, but you forgot about me. In which case, bad geometry. Same thing can go the opposite way around as well, similar in our previous triangle. Another you will see is, you can't stop me and you can't stop me. And ultimately, like, this looks like it'd be great geometry. But ultimately, I think these lines go off into different directions and never come to intersect. We create more distance here, I think, than anything. But not always. This can be good geometry if we make it work. Oftentimes, what you will hear in these kinds of dating scenarios, because people love to talk about themselves, is that they're, polyamorous or exploring open relationships because they aren't going to deprive themselves anymore. or because they're not going to hold themselves back anymore. If you notice, that's a lot of me, me, me. And again, is this distant elevation kind of angle. I have come to learn that that is a big red flag. And there is a subtle difference. There is a very subtle difference. And I learned this simply through platonic relationships. Um, if your best friend was to, I don't know, quit their job and move across the country to pick up a new dream, would your response be me, 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 or I love you, I love that for you, I would never hold you back? And that's the subtle difference. Ultimately, with these geometries, and I think in in geometry that ultimately works really well for these, really well for any relationship, for any and all relationships, is that even when one partner wants to explore or go outside of the intention, is still placed back on the other partner, because I'm going to enjoy myself, but I'm also going to keep in mind my partner's boundaries and my partner's integrity and ways that I can honor my relationship and my partner. And that's, being safe. That's being honest, and that's being integral. That's the ways in which you continue to protect your relationship, to honor the creation of your relationship. And that ultimately can help it grow. 100%. I think people got into polyamory for very selfish reasons, and it's ultimately a very selfless thing. The idea of compersion was very much a buzzword for a long time, but that's exactly that. It's not even just about the pleasure of the other person, like I just like get off seeing you get off. It is about wanting the best for them. It is about wanting joy for them. And again, I learned that through platonic relationships, in understanding that, like, though I'd miss my best friend if they moved, what kind of friend would I be if I told them, no, you can't do that, I'll miss you too much, like, no, don't follow your dream, da 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 da. In the same way that is all too accepted in relationships, where somehow it's sweet and territorial and endearing when somebody does not want good for you. And while I see that those two things are why we ended up with these geometries, because this is essentially like a hyper correction of the problems in here, but became the same triangle, became the same exploitation. Because even in this scenario where, like, homeboy is just trying to collect people and children and be God, um, in a polyamorous relationship, oftentimes people use other people as ways of validating uh, their own identity or capacity for desire, or their desirability, or altogether enter it so as to avoid their commitment issues altogether. Because ultimately, polyamory does take an incredible amount of communication to be able to honor this creation and simultaneously create something new. It is not a this or that, and that is a hard part of polyamory. It has to exist within the same plane. Or again, with this example, I feel like they end up drifting into different planes, because this will find another point to connect to, and then we have um, inverse reflection. For this to maintain the same plane is your why, and your attention, and your capacity for trust in your relationship, because this particle will always be thinking of this one, and this particle will always be thinking of this one, so that they can radiate and grow. One of my favorite ways of thinking about love is actually with the idea of the golden ratio, because love is, in fact, a growing thing, in which case you do have the one, and then the one finds the one, and they rock out and create something slightly unlike themselves that is not just a child, that it is not just offspring, that is the creation of an idea, which is also the creation of an agreement, which is the creation of the way these angles have to inform each other, which is why that was so important, because we can confirm that in these, the relationships of are not in agreement, are not informing each other appropriately, or in a way that has trigness, in a way that has truth. Whee! But we go back to this one, right? We go back to this one. We go back to this one. But we go back to this one. This is also your relationship with yourself. I know it'll piss people off if I say that I absolutely think that you have to learn how to love yourself before you can love other people. And that's not to say that you are not deserving. That is not to say that you are incapable. That is not to say that you ought to isolate. That is to say that if your patterning comes from a source of I do not love myself, then the patterns that you will create will repeat that. So it is very helpful to the kinds of relationships that you create to understand what that means to you. And this is where we have a relationship with ourself. And the geometry of all of these angles also informs each other. But what we see, similar to how this was God before, right? Is out of sight, sort of out of mind. These are the things we feel we've maybe lost control of, or the need for another partner in completion, and 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 where the idea of I'm not going to let anybody hold me back from experiencing what I want to experience in a relationship. That's selfish. That's flat plane. But because we're seeking this piece, right? This piece of the puzzle. In that, it is a relationship to you. And so, sure, we've got masculine and feminine, but they need to inform each other. Because at the end of the day, if the feminine creates, the masculine is the protector, is the honorer of that creation. My favorite example of this is in art, is in any kind of art, is in characters, is in performances, which is the construct of gender to begin with. When we can honor the creation of ourselves and no longer need to validate ourselves through quantity of people, and when we can honor the integrity of our relationships and the relationships that we create, then we have a very humble divine masc and a very keen and clear divine feminine. And those are also both principles within ourselves. And that is your clarity of sense of self and your ability to honor that, to honor with integrity that you are not just a yes man or a people pleaser. And this is how we get sucked into other people's narratives or other people's gaslighting or other people's patternings, really. And ultimately, I think in those situations, we lose sight of this again, and begin to lose sight of ourselves and only exist within whatever this is connected to, which is a problem, which is codependency at the end of the day. And when it is not codependency and it is in line, then we have not just this, but another symbol that I really enjoy, because Mercury is often used to denote alchemically the androgen. And that is when the divine masc and the divine feminine are actually one and the same. It's the transness of the way energy flows. It's the increased capacity to create and explore. And that will ultimately create a solid identity that can then reflect itself, that can then bond, that can then bond in a strong enough way that, yes, you can totally bring in another person or have a kid or start a business or, I don't know, buy a cactus to take care of together, whatever it is. And that is where we get the 5, because we're creating something together, creating an idea. And even in this public relationship thing, they're creating separately. They're creating in separate wills and in separate motivations, which ultimately I think goes to show that one party is in fact elevating in this manner, much like we would see in monogamous relationships rather than in polyamorous relationships, or in, oh gosh, where are my triangles? Or in or religiously driven relationships, which even then is a terrible word for it, because most often those relationships are not driven by spirit or God, they're driven by power. They're driven by consumption of power. Because even in our polyamorous example, you're driven by the other. Like, you're driven by the motivations of somebody, of the benefit or the comfort or the compersion of another. You're driven by the comfort or compersion of another. Religious relationships are often based off of pain and fear. Um, I don't know this relationship or its motivations, but status keeps people in check, in line, uh, aware of the same planes. And that's, again, not a commentary on who these people are. I think that is symptomatic of the kind of society we live in, that uh, even in seeking, uh, are seeking so outside of ourselves that we find ourselves bound to another pattern, just like the one that we came from, and running in the same current. I think if you can look at it that way, as that circuitry, then you can define the resistance as your ability to come together. It does drive current towards. So what ways does this push you together or pull you apart? And that's not to say, you know, just keep your head up. No, both of these are imbalanced and poorly motivated geometries. Feeling subordinated in an open relationship or forgotten or not part of that current in an open relationship, that is not polyamory. That is monogamy with a inclination for cheating. I can't even call that a fetish. In considering it as a capacitor, that resistance is also what can bring you closer together. Even water as a molecule has a core hydrophobic quality with hydrogen bonds, but it's exactly that. It's bonds. It's not resistance as in how much you will put up with. It's not resistance as in this is hard, I should try harder. It's resistance as in what is the hydrogen bond existing and what is its quality. What is the hydrogen bond is, again, this baseline part of the pyramid, of the triangle. It's this, which is your why, which is your trust. Is trust your bond? And often in either of these scenarios, we are not operating out of trust, we are operating out of power. And that is, unfortunately, because of clear misuse and perversion of power, which ultimately, regardless of philosophy or ideology or whatever it is that people looked for in these people, that will find themselves disappointed because they're back to triangle one, trying to find that missing piece. We cannot put people on a pedestal. Again, I don't know these people, I don't know this relationship, but based on the geometry of it and my own experiences, are we relating to each other well? Are we trying to relate to each other well? It's not all that complicated. And I think the ways in which we define love or trust or submission are all deeply integral to this. And they all also very much, again, inform each other. Unfortunately, too many people's ideas of submission is fascism and control. Unfortunately, too many people's ideas of trust is fascism and control. Unfortunately, too many people's ideas of love is fascism and control and transaction and 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 selfishness because of that, which is also a form of fascism and control. But when you can relate to one person or another, you'll be there. In an ideal polyamorous relationship, whoever and whoever and whoever would be able to flow consciously, because my attention will be here, but my honoring will be here. My intention will be here, but my honoring will be here. My intention will be here, but my honoring will be here. And that's actually, there's a symbol. That's kind of like a random sketch, but that looks very similar to the BDSM symbol. And that is because you're always both honoring and creating simultaneously, which is a very queer way of thought, which, in my opinion, and at least in my practice, is the queer agenda. Understanding how you can exist in this reflective plane in a way that has great capacity to connect, in a way that has quality hydrogen bonds in between possibilities. But this would also mean that you are your own joy. So nobody's going to hold you back from experiencing or exploring or taking these opportunities or whatever it is that is already there. That's already you. So yeah, I think polyamory can be really beautiful. I think a lot of people are very blinded by their own wounds or ego or status. I think a lot of people don't start that way. But I also think that we have a very poor, as a society, very poor understanding of what a relationship is, platonic or otherwise, of what, again, love, trust, or what it means to submit in a religious or otherwise way, or what it is to be a divine femme or a divine masc in the world. Because I think again, the divine feminine is a creator, yes, but not just in the physical reliant and dependent terms that we describe it as. which is also why which is also why history subordinated so many prominent female artists, especially within occult history. Occult history in the tarot deck is the perfect example because it was written by a man but illustrated by a woman, and we only really know about one. That is an example of, and I'm sure they were practicing fun stuff, but they still exist in these monogamous religious geometries of their relationships. Ultimately, I think a lot of people put on a pedestal uh, these people because they, present the way that they do or what have you, or put on. I'm sure people put on a pedestal this person, this Aubrey Marcus person, as a divine mask, and that doesn't resonate with me at all. I think the divine mask honors, and the divine mask in this scenario uh, is never satisfied, which is an incredible expectation. And you know what? I have meditated on this before, and I saw the masculinity that is so prominent, and it is a whiny baby that wants everything. Actually, I think I have my meditation notebook right here. Let's see. It's not a notebook, it's a sketchbook. And I wrote it in here. But can I find it? Is another question. Let's see. Let's see. Ah, somewhere between 1 and 2. Let's see. Oh, yeah. He is randy and insatiable. Bottom, definitely. Heathen, for sure. He wants to see the world, to be filled, to experience fully. But limitless can still have boundaries and direction. But limitless can still have boundaries and direction and not feel trapped. My leg shakes. He doesn't always know what he wants. My leg shakes. My knee. I kissed him on the forehead. He wouldn't stand a chance with my north. But to bring it back to this, any relationship idea or creation is an circuit, is an and that resistance, as counterintuitive as it may seem, is in fact indicative of your ability to come together. And that is not resistance as in how much you can put up with, that that is how much you can control yourself. That is how much you are not the whiny, screaming, I want more and give it to me now, never satisfied, exploitative, masculine energy that we have very prevalent now. Um, and then your ability to, you create a very aqueous solution of hydrogen bonds that, like a surface tension on water, can't really be broken. And so you can have a very stable and very beautiful relationship in any modality, because this is also to very much illustrate to you that polyamory and monogamy are really not that different, especially the way that they're being practiced today. The ways that polyamorous people shit on monogamy but also do the same thing is so hilarious to me. And that's not to say all of them, because there are people that took their heads out of their ass and actually can communicate, and are in this for everybody's benefit, not just for their own pleasure. Because again, your pleasure is yours, and that is not something that you need to outsource to other people. Your joy is yours. I mean, gosh, even in meditation, you can hands free that. But that's maybe a little bit more of a fun way of doing it. Don't put anybody on a pedestal. Don't trust any of these weird, wounded spirit cult leaders, especially more than yourself. Key point, more than yourself. And that's very true in relationships too, because ultimately, in a relationship with any partner, you have a unified truth to be together. And when one person starts gaslighting you, then these degrees start to inform each other differently. And if you are aware of your degrees of separation rather than opposition, you can understand where there's breakings in the geometry. Very easy example. Let's say you said you didn't leave this thing on the counter, and your partner is a narcissistic gaslighter. And they're like, yes, you did. I saw you. How are you going to say that you didn't? Yes, you did. You always do that. And in fact, you no, you didn't. You checked the cameras in the house. You know you didn't. You took a photo of it on the counter. So you know you didn't. This is where these angles and these degrees starts to uh, mold. Because ultimately, if you start to question yourself, then your geometry starts to assimilate into theirs. If you start to subordinate yourself, then you create more attention and more power toward them, toward their energy. It's sort of like a short circuit. Um, if you are very sure of yourself, too sure of yourself, then we have these elevating angles, right? If you are too unsure of yourself, then you are naturally that angle walking into these relationships. And so, again, maybe these aren't always things that occur because somebody's intentional or evil or what have you. Sometimes they oscillate because of requirement. If you're walking into a situation with this energy, then somebody's going to want to try and overcompensate. Um, or they meet you where you're at, and then we find ourselves amoebaing in codependency, or maybe just not seeing eye to eye at all. Either way, these angles are also not just found here. This is also how we inform the angles in astrology, with an opposition or a square. Squares would be, bam, it would be here, bam, or a square. You see that 90-degree angle, or whenever I see triangulating angles, oftentimes it's multiple planets influencing each other because they have these geometries. Again, the ways the angles influence each other. That is true of all of the angles of measurement in astrology as well as basic principles of measuring triangles of geometry. Both of these things overlap. Anyway, I hope that was interesting and that you do not write off one or the other without first fully understanding it. And that perhaps you find it very funny just how similar these dynamics are in both their explorations and their exploitations. We are not that dissimilar after all. And neither is your relationship to yourself and your capacity to honor and protect your own creation. That is my queer agenda, is the alchemical androgen of creation. And ultimately, it informs everything, whether you believe it or not. uh, anyway, party on. Um, and I hope that you ponder about your own geometry of relationship to yourself, as well as the geometry of relationship that you are in, and your angles of relation. How does your masculine and your feminine connect in you inherently before it connects with anybody else? The only way that we'll get clear about that is to accept it. And in that, it is as queer and bizarre as water and its capacity for hydrogen bonding. And we perhaps have been a little messy and a little careless with the water as we move it. And that goes for both, again, in their explorations and their exploitations. But yeah, I hope that was at least fun, especially if you were disappointed or are feeling some type of way about that whole shenanigans. And if you are in whatever kind of relationship that you are in or considering exploring, I hope that that gives you some clearer ideas of how to navigate this, and where your attention or motivations or understandings really ought to uh, spend some time really investigating, and really sharing in that, because if love is anything, it is a growing thing, and it is something that we share. It is not because it is shared between us and that's the only time it creates. It is because I have so much love that I have some to share with you. So enjoy it. But don't ever feel deprived, and don't ever feel trapped in any relationship. Put it on paper and find out the geometry of truth. My hope is that in these understandings, perhaps we will alleviate a bit of the perversion of power that is so rampant, uh, in things that could have been sacred, that wanted to be, even. But yeah, how hilarious! How hilarious! What a world! But yeah, go out there, have fun, and also don't let anybody fucking define your truth.